let us get started. We've got a fantastic panel here today. It's such a great crowded room. It's wonderful to see you, and I'm sure there's more people listening online too. So, speak up. Okay. I'm Andrea Shalal with Reuters, and I'm very pleased to be here. This is such an important issue. I spend a lot of time doing this professionally. Meaning looking at the structures of the IMF and the World Bank, and there we go. Is that better? Yes. Okay. Sorry, I was trying to do this. Okay. There's something about panels where the panelists can receive. Oh, sorry. Yeah. It's very warm in this room. Okay. So our purpose today is to have a very high-level discussion with some of the foremost experts on this about some of the, maybe one of the most critical problems facing us right now is we have these overlapping multiple crises and institutions that don't seem to be ready and able to sort of respond in an appropriate way, so that everything seems to be falling short. And I think the intention of this panel is to talk about how to strengthen multilateralism through governance reforms at the International Monetary Fund. So we're going to be talking about an upcoming review of the IMF quota, and we'll have, I think, some really interesting contributions on that. We're going to start, our panelists are Paulo Nogueira Batista, the former Brazilian executive director at the IMF, who's behind us, and joining us remotely. Having some very nice coffee or tea. So we'll go in this order. Paulo will go first, and then Lara will go second. She is the senior policy advisor at Boston University and has done some really important work about quotas and how it works now, and also disparities in terms of who gets what money. And then we'll go to Karim Al-Hajj, sitting next to me here, who's one of the founders of Arab Watch Coalition, and then to Martin Guzman, who's probably known to many of you as the former finance minister of Argentina, and someone who's spent a long time understanding and trying to understand these questions. So without any further ado, Paulo, the floor is yours. Can you hear us?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good afternoon. Okay, good afternoon to all. I thank the organizers of this panel, this conference, for the opportunity they gave me to participate in this panel on IMF governance reform in light of the upcoming quota review. I spent 8 years at the IMF as executive director for Brazil and a number of other countries. And one of the topics that I most worked on during these 8 years was exactly this one that you proposed today, the issue of IMF governance reform. Now, at the time, to put it very starkly and briefly, the question that was in the minds of emerging market and developing countries mostly was the following one. Is the IMF really honoring its acronym, its name and acronym, IMF? It have another acronym in its place, NAMF, North Atlantic Monetary Fund. International or North Atlantic Monetary Fund? And what I will say very briefly here today is an overview of what I think should be the geopolitics of the IMF reform. IMF reform is a technical issue. It is. Financial, yes, but it is fundamentally, essentially, in my view, a geopolitical issue. I do not need to go over the issue of the creation of the fund, how it emerged. Adam Tooze said a few words about that in the previous panel. It was mostly a US-UK creation, US-European creation, with the US having all the money, and the UK, according to some of its major representatives, having all the brains. Now, money weighs more than brains in the end, and the US dominated the fund. It was not, at the start, a truly global institution, because a large part of the world belonged to the Soviet bloc. The IMF only became a near universal institution when the dissolution of the Soviet bloc occurred in the early 90s. Even the Soviet Union broke apart. The countries of this former Soviet bloc, almost all of them joined the fund, and the fund became a near universal institution. However, this new universal institution did not reflect, say that was the situation when I came to Washington at the beginning of the 21st century, did not reflect the world economic and demographic realities. Just to give you one figure, which is really amazing when you stop to think about it. If you look at the one hand at the West, and on the other hand at the rest of the world, the West and the rest now has 85% of world population. And emerging market and developing countries have an increasing share of world GDP, especially East Asia, but EMDCs as a whole. So the political West, US, Canada, Europe, plus Japan and a few other developed countries, has a diminishing share of population and of economic power. Now, the IMF still bears the marks of its creation, in my view, to a large extent. It's still NAMF and not IMF, North Atlantic Monetary Fund. And the issues remain the ones that I faced. The specific issues of governance reform of the fund, remain the ones I faced when I was at the board of the fund. Fundamentally four.
That chat out. Just make it so it's not visible. Sorry.
Fundamentally four issues we have here. Quota distribution, which is the main factor behind voting power distribution. The composition of the board, where Europe is overrepresented. Europe has 1/3 of the chairs, or more or less. The choice of the MD, which obeys an unwritten rule, as in the World Bank, a U.S. national is always the number one of the bank. These are two unwritten rules that have been obeyed since the Second World War, since the creation of these institutions. And U.S. veto power. U.S. veto power. The U.S. is the only single country that individually has veto power. Now, we had a window of opportunity between 2008 and 2010 to change the fund and make it a truly international institution. We achieved some progress with a lot of effort in one of the four issues, which is the distribution of voting power through quota redistribution. But the progress we achieved with all this effort and personal sacrifice was slow, remarkably slow, and incomplete. I have no time to explain this in detail, but I just highlight for you two brief facts. First, we've achieved the 2010 governance reform, which was the most important one in the history of the fund, probably. And it took us 5 years to put into practice because the U.S. Congress blocked ratification of the reform. So when the reform finally came out, I was no longer in the fund. I was already in China, working in the new development bank created by the BRICS. And the reform was also incomplete because what we call the forward-looking elements, the redefinition of the quota formula, and the new round of quota and voting distribution never happened. Never happened. And to close this initial presentation, since then, since 2010, when we achieved this major step, the world suffered a number of shocks. For example, the rise of the new right in the US and Europe, the deterioration dramatic in the relations between US and China, between Russia and China, the COVID-19 pandemic, the war in Ukraine. And these shocks, very important ones, came on top of the long-standing resistance of the West, US and Europe, to fundamental change in international governance institutions, and the fund in particular. Frankly, my view is that the prospects now for further reform of the fund, the international governance of the IMF, are very limited, very limited. The geopolitical fundamentals of the world now lead to fragmentation of international governance, increasing rise of national, regional, plurilateral, non-regional arrangements, and the IMF is probably more resistant to change now than it was at the beginning of the 20th century. Thank you. I hand back the floor.
Thank you so much. Laura, can you go on?
I prepared a few slides and I'm going to try and go through them very quickly because we heard how advocacy in the US is very important for surcharges and SDRs, and a lot about, we had heard mentioned that advanced economies control things. So I wanted to show how that works, and since we're talking about quota reforms, why do IMF quotas matter and what they are. And the idea is that they matter for voting power and how decisions are made. They matter for lending access. They impact the surcharge policy. They impact the special drawing rights allocations. And then the last example I'm going to use is about climate policy and how the IMF is introducing it in its operation and who will get to make the decisions on that. Just really briefly, IMF quota shares, each country has a share. When they join the IMF, they're based on a formula that should reflect their relative size in the global economy. They also determine how much financially countries contribute to the IMF. And we heard already that right now the 16th review is underway. But in the last 30 years, only 2 reviews of IMF quotas resulted in an increase, which is also why the IMF now has other arrangements actually for resources, and quotas are not actually the main source of money for its lending. We heard people mentioning the Articles of Agreement. Those are the charter of the IMF. The 190 countries are the shareholders. The US holds 16.5 of voting power. People mentioned they have a veto. So that means a lot of decisions need an 85% majority, so the US has to be on board. And then if we look just like at the structure, the Board of Governors is on top. That's every country is represented, and that's where they vote according to their voting share. The Executive Board is here year-round, and the countries are divided in 24 offices, and then there's a managing director. And as Paul also mentioned, there's still a gentleman's agreement from 1944 in place that says a European leads the IMF, an American the World Bank, and that's still how this choice is made on who leads these, supposedly international institutions. But I guess actually the North Atlantic description is more accurate. And then here, you can see it there, I have this table that kind of shows a little bit what the quotas look, what the votes look, what the population looks, and where that is in terms of the size of these economies if we adjust for purchasing power parity. And it's very obvious that the part where most of the population of the world doesn't have most of the votes. And we have the advanced economies that have 13.7% of the world's population and almost 60% of the votes. And even if we look by size of the economy, the actual formula now is a lot more complicated and has all of these other factors. It's not even reflecting anymore like their share of the world economy. And if we look also on the climate point, climate vulnerable countries, they have a lot more people than advanced economies, but 5% of votes. Another way to also look at it is who borrows from the IMF and who has IMF programs that have conditionality. So if we look at the programs that were completed in the last 20 years, only 7 were in so-called advanced economies, and that was after the financial crisis. Most of them concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, and then climate vulnerable countries. We are here looking at the V20 group of 55 climate vulnerable countries, so it's an overlap with the other emerging and developing countries, but also a lot of IMF programs. So a lot of the situation that they're in, the IMF plays a role because that situation is they're very vulnerable to the risks of climate change and have no fiscal space and don't have the means and have high debt levels and have a hard time being able to address that. And then this is how the IMF board looks once you split the 190 countries and constituencies. They're sized by how many votes are in each office. And I think the point that is very clear and immediately obvious is that there's one circle here that's much bigger than everything else, and that's the United States. And then there's a couple of other countries that have their own office, and then a couple more where they have an office with more countries, but one country clearly dominates the number of votes. And then on the surcharges point, the IMF quota contributions were meant to be the basis for its lending, but now, when the IMF says it has 1 trillion firepower, actually like above half of that comes from other arrangements and not quotas. But surcharge policy and all the other lending limits are still based on quota percentages. Surcharge policy is, if a loan is larger than 187.5% of quota, for the emergency facilities that have no conditionalities, were used a lot during COVID, the access limits are also based on quotas. But if we look here, and this is a very simple way I looked at the active loans that are now in the general resource account that were just signed. So we see that there's 12 of them, and 8 of them, the amounts agreed on are, way above what would be the surcharge threshold, which makes, puts the question is that like really a threshold where it's excessive lending, or is the kind of lending needed for any country in this moment and to address the crisis just much higher than where IMF quotas are at? On the special drawing rights point, it's come up in a lot of discussions this week on why, there was this allocation that was a historic allocation. Why did most of it go to advanced economies and wealthy countries that didn't need it? That happens because they're distributed based on IMF quotas. So the countries with high quotas got most of it. And that's how we see, the distribution. But what I want to note here in this system is that even though that happened, and only out of the 650 billion, only 200 billion went to the rest of the world if we exclude China, it was still the largest type of support these countries received during the pandemic that was debt-free. And then on the climate policy point, this is again coming back to the V20, and looking at, they have 4% of quota shares, 5.3% of the votes, 16.7% of the world population, and over a third of IMF programs have been in this country. And now, as the IMF will incorporate climate into its policies and it's mainstreaming that, they're not going to have any contribution into how that is done. So kind of the main takeaways here is that the IMF is not accountable to its borrowers. By its actual governance structure, it responds to creditor countries and the countries where the financial institutions that lend also on the private markets are based. For climate too, it means that you have the historical emitters and the countries that caused the problem deciding how it's going to be addressed and what's going to happen to the countries that are most vulnerable. This is something that I included there even though I didn't get over it, because one of the arguments on linking the quotas to voting power is about safeguarding the resources. But the IMF is already a preferred creditor, so its resources are pretty safe because it has a good place in the legal hierarchy of countries have to pay it back. And additionally there, the other side point is half of the IMF's resources come outside of the quota system, and that doesn't add to votes, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. So the idea is that quota reform is a prerequisite to have a multilateral system that is actually inclusive. And if we have the G7, the US always talking about a rules-based multilateral order, but right now the rules there favor certain countries and are made by certain countries. So if that point wants to be taken seriously of inclusive multilateralism, they should at least go ahead with that. And that's all.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I think let's go to Kareem now, and we will get a completely different perspective, I think, or maybe a similar perspective.
Yeah, it's a different perspective, but it's a perspective coming from the ground, coming from the MENA region and from the Tunisian experience with the IMF and in relation with the governance and the quotas. So, as I told you, the MENA, just want to emphasize at the beginning that the MENA,
Karim, can I ask you to speak up?
yes, intermediate consideration can't be considered as one region, because at least we have two MENAs in the same region. We can't compare Gulf countries to other countries, starting from Jordan to Palestine, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, and Morocco. And the situation is quite different socially and economically in those two parts of the MENA. In Tunisia, which I'm going to focus on, you know all that we launched the Arab Spring in 2011, and we were supposed to be one of the new democracy with a very high perspective or will to set also a new economic and social regime that can meet the expectation of citizens in Tunisia, because the rise in 2011 was about economic and social issues that happens before 2011. But unfortunately now we are maybe in the best scenario at the same level of 2011, if I'm not talking about a worst scenario, because in 2016 we started a new phase of economic and social crisis. At the beginning in 2012 we brought, or the IMF, the International Financial Institution, and the G7 gave us a lot of money. We get loans, we get donation, we get every kind of financial support that we can get from abroad, because we were the democracy, the new democracy that we want to build. The problem at that time was lack of political governance, and I can say now that almost all the money that we brought was wasted in social, how to say it, just to make people think about something else than politics and economic issues. We are just giving the image of a new country, but the situation inside was not the one that we were giving to the institutions, to our donors, and to the entire world. So the political governance was our problem. The problem also is that we lost our foreign policy vision. At the beginning, we were in total accordance with the USA, but our president 2 years ago decided that not to be anymore in agreement with the USA, which hold the decision in the IMF, for example. So he decided to claim our sovereignty, but our sovereignty from what? As a citizen, we don't know. Our sovereignty from the donations, maybe, but we have to work to avoid donation and to avoid bringing loans from abroad. So the situation is going worse. Now the inflation is around, the general inflation is around 9%, but it can reach 25% in food and in some other areas. By the end of the year, we are expecting it to reach, the general inflation to reach 10 to 12% for 2022. The rating also is decreasing. Now we are CCC1 rated, and we need a guarantee to get or to access financial flows coming from abroad. The debt, a Tunisian newly born, has to pay around 18,000 dinars, which equal to $6,000, knowing that it's about $500 a month, which is 3 times the minimum salary guaranteed by the government in Tunisia. So each time any new Tunisian born has to pay 3 times the salary guaranteed by the state to international donors, according to official statistics. That can be, and the situation can be worse, because one of the what we are claiming as civil society in Tunisia and as citizen also
recording in progress,
to know about the reality of our debt and the president asked the financial minister in Tunisia to audit the debt and to prepare a report which was presented to him 3 months ago. But even using the access to information in Tunisia, we didn't get access to the report to know more about our debt. So coming back to the governance and the quota, Tunisia for the moment, the last solution to maintain a statu quo, even in the worst situation that we are facing, is to go or to get an agreement with the IMF, based on a very weak quota that we have, even within the region, within the MENA region. The reforms, how can the quota affect the citizen? All the reforms proposed by the government just to meet the expectation of the IMF will affect directly the Tunisian citizen. One of them is to stop or to cut hardly all the subsidies given to basic needs. The government in Tunisia is bringing us coffee, sugar, tea, wheat. So all those goods are brought by the government for us. And one of the conditions that's one of the reforms between brackets that we have to propose to the IMF is to cut hardly all the subsidies for those subsidies. So even the gas, the gas we are for 1 week now that I left Tunisia, there is no gas in the stations. You need to have the queue for 4 hours at least to get the gas because of the triple C that we were rated in. The government is not able to buy gas from abroad. So you see now how can the quota and the governance of the IMF can be in an indirect way affect the citizen in Tunisia.
We'll have more time to talk too. I think we really need to move on because we want to create opportunities for exchange and dialogue as well. Martine, I'm sorry I introduced you as the former finance minister, but in fact you were the economy minister. I apologize. Please. And I don't mean to cut you off, Karim, but we want to get more into a dialogue too.
Okay, thank you, Andrea. I try to speak loud, so it's something that I do usually, but I know I have no mic. Andrea laid out the key issues very clearly, which is said that we don't have the institutions that we have are not ready and able to deal with this moment for the global economy. So let me begin by describing what this moment means and what this moment is about, and then move to the issue of governance from a comprehensive angle and provide an overview of what's the system that we have now in order to deal with the moment that the global economy and particularly countries from the global south are going through. And let me thank the previous speakers for your very insightful remarks. We had a series of events that have been very, very difficult for a number of economies to absorb. We had the pandemic, then the war in Ukraine, and these events happened after decades in which we had seen in large parts of the world increases in inequality within countries that have brought significant social discontent and political instability. And central banks from the advanced economies are responding to the shocks that created the global problem of inflation in the usual fashion, despite the fact that these are not just standard aggregate demand shocks. These are supply shocks, shocks to the production chains, and there are significant spillovers from the actions of central banks from the advanced economies to the rest of the world. Significant international spillovers. And these spillovers happen in a context in which the debt levels in the world are higher than 3 years ago, precisely because there was a pandemic and countries had to do expansionary policies. Of course, there were countries that had more capacity to do expansionary policies, but for economies from the global south, in large number of economies, there is a problem of sustainability. In what environment, in what global environment and international financial architecture will these problems have to be resolved in what I would deem as a non-system. It's a bit like the law of the jungle. So let me describe three key aspects that different economies will have to deal with in order to resolve their debt crisis. The first one will refer to the nature of the negotiations between debtors in distress and private creditors. The second, the new inter-creditor coordination problems that countries will face to resolve their crisis. And the third, the role of the IMF. And I know we have limited time, so I'm going to try to be brief, and you and please let me know when I have 1 minute left. One important thing, sovereign debt contracts are what we call incomplete contracts, meaning that we cannot write in a contract all the possible contingencies that will affect the payment capacity of a debtor. Who would have known that there could be a pandemic followed by a war, right? That's why these contracts come with a risk premium. The risk premium is a recognition that there will be certain instances in which the debtor will not make the transfers that are supposed to occur to the creditors. That's part of what creditors accept when they get paid a risk premium. So there should be no big stigma about sovereign debt restructuring. Actually, if countries pay a risk premium and they never restructure their debt, there will be rents, okay? However, there is a big stigma.
Meaning, rent is an economic word, which means excess profit.
Exactly, there is excess profits, more than what should be normal. However, when the country is in a situation in which it needs to restructure, the process becomes very convoluted, protracted, very complicated. And as I said, it works in a this process works in a decentralized way. There's bargaining between the debtor and the creditors, which are many. We're talking about, it depends on the country. In Argentina, we have more than 50 investment funds and hedge funds, right? And coordination is a big problem. And the system is featured by pervasive asymmetries. Asymmetries in terms of power, lobbying capacity, access to financial networks, and asymmetries of information. Creditors generally ask for transparency. Today, mostly because of the debts of a number of African nations with China. But transparency should go both ways. The debtors know very little about the creditors. For instance, in Argentina, we hired an information agency to know who our bondholders were, and we only knew a fraction of our base of bondholders. And we didn't know whether creditors held sovereign credit default swaps, meaning that they could have different incentives in the restructuring processes and not incentives to cooperate because they will get paid anyways. And on top of this, there are significant domestic political economy problems. This is one of the most pervasive problems in sovereign restructurings. The debtor is not a homogeneous entity. It's a complex system that includes a political system with actors that may have different interests, short-term interests, or they may be financing campaign contributions from the creditors. So governments are also, generally their behavior is such that they don't start restructuring processes timely. So we see an alignment of incentives between creditors that prefer to see what we see in the actual world, which is called the too little and too late problem, meaning that we don't start the restructurings on time, and when they happen, we don't get enough relief, and the debtor may actually have the same incentives. And that's what's been creating a lot of problems, or part of what's been creating a lot of problems over the last 4 decades. Second, the universe of creditors has been evolving. And today, we do not only have problems of coordination among the bondholders, but also we have problems of coordination between Paris Club creditors, non-Paris Club creditors, and private bondholders. And the questions that these problems raise do not have trivial answers. For instance, what should a country do? I'm sorry, that is quite hot here. If a country has access to financing from one class of creditor and not from another class of creditor, why should it restructure the debt with the creditor that provides financing at cheap rates if that's happening, while it may be necessary to restructure that with other creditors that do not provide financing? And we will see that this will be a very important part of the global discussion for the resolution of the distress in the near future. And finally, the role of the IMF. I want to say a few things about the IMF. First, let me start with something that it's important in any sovereign debt restructuring process: the debt sustainability analysis. Every restructuring process needs to have a well-formulated debt sustainability analysis that identifies the payment capacity of the debtor. And then there should be a negotiation about the intercreditor distribution of the resources. Okay? The institution that is supposed to provide these so-called DSAs for debt sustainability analysis is the IMF. In the past, many times, most of the times, the IMF has produced DSAs that contributed to this too little and too late problem. In the case of Argentina, it was interesting because IMF produced a DSA that said that there had to be a significant debt restructuring with significant relief, and creditors didn't like it. Somehow they didn't complain in the past when the IMF was saying, they have to, the country will grow a lot and we have capacity to pay, so what the country needs to do is fiscal austerity, but they did complain about this one. Mm-hmm. Okay? So at the end, this debt sustainability analysis, in order to be effective in the role that they are supposed to play in anchoring creditors' expectations, need to be legitimate, founded on the right premises, on the right evidence, the right theory, but also be supported by the large shareholders at the IMF that should respect them if they are well done. There is another dimension in which they help, which is to deal with the domestic political economy problem, right? Because it's not the same when just a negotiator says this is the kind of debt operation that we need, than if the IMF is also saying it. So this helps to deal with the domestic political economy problems. Second, the IMF is in clear need for a revision of some of its key policies. One is the so-called surcharges policy. The colleagues from CPR have done some of the best work on this issue. What's the surcharges policy? The IMF charges extra interest to countries in crisis. Every country that has an outstanding loan above 187.5% of its quota, it pays 200 extra basis points, or if it took longer than a certain period of time for the country to repay, it charges 100 extra basis points extra. All the arguments that different shareholders or IMF members have put on the table for defending this policy, really, they make no sense. No sense. This is a policy that is destabilizing, and it works for.
Martin, we need to move on.
One minute, last minute? Or?
Okay, yeah, no, you're way past minutes.
Sure.
No, I mean, honestly, we've talked about the governance issue, but I think we want to get into some of the details, right? So we have surcharges, we have an SDR system that weights toward the big countries that doesn't, and the redistribution system hasn't worked. So, there have been some attempts now to try to create some reforms, right? The advanced countries, the G20 countries, the major economies in the world agreed to donate 100 billion of SDRs. Why didn't that work? Why isn't that working so far, right? So, Lara, you're nodding emphatically, and then I want to bring
because you said donate, and that's actually the wrong term, because they agreed to
channel,
by which they mean they're gonna take this thing that they received and lend it on to other countries and get paid the interest, which is very different from what a donation would look like.
Right, they can do both. They could donate and they can channel.
Yeah,
but up to now, so of the 100 billion, up to now only 80 billion have been pledged, and 21 of that billion is from the United States, which needs congressional approval to make that happen, and that is something that people consider to be a fairly unlikely prospect. And then, so it hasn't worked until now, really. What other reforms could happen, and how realistic is it that they could happen? Paulo? We might have lost him just now.
You have to connect again.
Tunisia just today reached a staff level agreement with the IMF for $1.9 billion. It should be finalized in December. It essentially will replicate the old types of structures, right? I mean, there's so what do you think? What could be done now, right, in terms of changing the system, or do we have to sort of start from scratch?
Anyway, I think from the Tunisian perspective that we have to continue to change the system, because even if we reach the staff agreement today, as you are saying, that we reached a staff agreement for $1.9 billion around. Our needs are around $4 billion, and we are going anyway to debts again. The problem is that we have stock of debts that we are not really aware about how important it is for the Tunisian citizen and what can be the impact on the fiscal. The fiscal pressure in Tunisia is around 25%, especially for civil servants who are paying taxes even before being paid. So, yes, we reached the staff agreement, but what after the staff agreement? Are we going to have impactful reforms that can balance social and economic needs of the population? I'm not sure.
Martin, your government managed to renegotiate Argentina's debt.
Recording in progress.
You see 11 restructuring, right, of Argentina's debt. So what were you able to accomplish in that renegotiation? And what was the impact of that? And was that successful? Because there've been a lot of challenges even since you left government.
Good. So there were three parts to the problem: the debt with the private holders, the debt with the IMF, and the debt with the Paris Club. And on the three parts, we reached different understandings. We restructured $65 billion debt with private creditors under foreign law, and $40 billion debt with private creditors under Argentine law. And the restructuring entailed significant relief. It was a relief of $35 billion over a period of a decade. And that meant that in 2020 and 2021, Argentina had almost no payments of debt denominated in foreign currency. And with the IMF, we refinanced, which was the record loan of the IMF to any nation, $45 billion. Therefore, we've been rolling over that debt. That's, of course, been very important for the economic recovery that Argentina experienced in 2021. The economy grew 10.4%. Unemployment rate came down from 13% to 7%. It would, of course, if Argentina had been under the need to pay a massive debt burden, Argentina wouldn't have had the resources to do the policies that we needed for the economic recovery.
So it was successful in some respects.
Well, in the respect that we prioritize the use of the scarce foreign exchange resources of the country for the recovery of the economy and for the welfare of the people, rather than putting the interest of foreign creditors that had received a high risk premium when they started to borrow in 2016, 7% interest rate in a world of zero interest rate. In that sense, certainly, but of course, the burden of the debt, especially in the IMF, is massive. This is a huge loan that Argentina took in 2018, and it means that there will be a complex relationship with the institution for years.
Yeah. Paulo, I want to bring you in, if you can hear us, about this compounding and rolling debt problem, that it just doesn't, you just restructure it, a bit goes away, but then there's more debt. Countries, the scale is obviously different. The quota rate of Argentina is extraordinarily high, over 1,000%. Egypt is negotiating today, right now, they're at the IMF, and people there have said the country needs essentially 1,000% of quota for Egypt to be able to move ahead. What can happen to interrupt this cycle, Paulo? You sat inside the IMF for a very long time, and the people within the institutions, both at the World Bank and the IMF, are not bad people. They want to create change, right? They want to help countries. I think maybe this is wrong, but from your perspective, from the inside, what do you think could interrupt this kind of recurring cycle?
Well, it's true the IMF and the World Bank people are not bad people. They are people, and they respond to interests and power. And the problem with the role of the IMF in debt crisis since the very beginning of the life of the institution, example, during the Latin American debt crisis in the 1980s, during the East Asian crisis, during the Argentinian crisis, the IMF, given its governance structure, which I commented upon, Lara also, Martin Guzman also, given the structure of power in the institution, the IMF tends to take the viewpoint and the side of the creditors in debt issues. This is a simplification. It said tends to, but mostly it sides with the creditors. Why? Because the creditors, until very recently, now China is a new factor mentioned by Martin Guzman, but until very recently, the creditors were mostly Western creditors, US, European creditors. Exactly those powers that have overwhelming influence in the IMF board, in the IMF as an institution. So what we face as emerging markets and developing countries is an institution that can help, yes, but it helps looking very much at the issue of debt restructuring from the viewpoint of the creditors. And that's why we need an IMF reform to make it a truly institution, truly world institution, truly global institution, and not a North Atlantic monetary fund. But again, I think we can improve some things in the IMF, even with this situation I described. But the geopolitical pattern in the world makes, at most, tinkering at the margins possible in the IMF. And I think emerging markets like Brazil, Argentina, and others will have to look increasingly at their own capabilities in concert with other developing countries to escape these difficulties that we now face.
I want to open it up to some questions from the floor. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just have to inject a little note of optimism here, because we did win that $650 billion, and I can tell you from sources both in the Congress and the administration, the only reason we got it is because the House passed it twice, and Treasury was afraid that it would pass at some point with even more SDRs. And if you want more proof of it, look at Treasury right now. They are violently opposed to another issuance at a time when the economy is vastly worse than it was in August of 2021 and getting worse. So this is the real problem. And I just want to say one word about the actual solution, because that's what we're here for. We have focused on the Congress because that's the least unaccountable part of a government that controls the IMF through the Treasury Department. And so that is, I mean, I'm not saying the rest of the world can't do something. You know, they will. And the WTO, they did it, okay? They've held back most of the WTO agenda in the last 20 years, and maybe we'll get some movement like that as well. You know, if people want to contribute to any of this, you can get us at CPER.net. But I just want to say that we'll win the next issuance and we'll win the surcharges battle too, because of the pressure that goes to the Congress and then to the Treasury. That's the only way we're going to win it in the short term. In the long term, the governance reform may take a little more or a lot more, but it's still going to be the big stuff.
We had a couple of other questions over here. Go ahead. Yes.
Hi. Yolanda from Eurodat. I understand and I agree that the key issues is advocacy in the US, but also in Europe. But I was wondering also if you could say something about global South coordination, and what if you see that as important. Today, October 15th, always marks the anniversary of the assassination of Thomas Sankara 35 years ago, who tried to create a debtors coalition in Africa, and it's one of the reasons why he was killed. But also we saw how the Cartagena coalition failed in the 80s to create also a Latin American borrowers club. We are hearing some proposals around borrowing countries, coordinating not only for facing better debt restructuring processes, but it could also be for this governance reform. Do you think that a stronger, more coordinated single voice from the global South countries would help in that, in this battle, in these governance battles? And what are the obstacles for that? Why are not we seeing, more a coordinated voice from the global South? Thank you.
Martin, do you want to start?
Sure. Two questions. First, a reaction to Mark's question. At the end, the changes in the funds policies depend mainly on the geopolitics. There are massive asymmetries of power. In the case of the surcharges, the majority of countries actually want a review and a revision of this policy. And it's just a bunch of countries, and the main opposition does come from the US Treasury. So all this advocacy is very important. Also, this is a non-transparent policy, and many times people don't even know. I can tell you an anecdote. This morning I spoke about a number of issues, including the surcharges at the Group of the 30, and when I finished, a central banker from an advanced economy told me, "Oh, that it's very interesting what you described. They didn't know." So that's how things are. On Yolanda's comment, the debtors club. I think so. First, creditors work with a logic. There is a typical covenant in sovereign debt contracts called a cross-default clause. What does it mean? If you touch one, you touch everyone. Okay, but we don't have the same for debtors. I'm not optimistic about that at all. The domestic political economy problems are very complicated, and that kind of coordination is difficult to achieve. Ultimately, what the world needs, the real missing piece, is an international mechanism for sovereign debt restructuring. So we won't resolve the problems until we have that.
Where would that have to reside? This mechanism, what institution do you trust enough to actually, run that?
It's a question. The question is about power.
I understand, but I'm asking you, the United Nations isn't effective, right?
But it should. The UN should be able to perform the role that it's supposed to play. In 2014,
sorry, Martin, the structure of the United Nations, think about the Security Council. We're at an absolute, complete impasse now because Russia is part of the Security Council of the United Nations. So in the environment in which we are right now, where we're having this discussion, in a war where the international institutions are not functioning as well as they could, how's that? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
One comment. So it has to be designed in a way that works, and certainly that wouldn't be the way. It's what Paulo said. There has been a change in the economic distribution of power that is not reflected into a change in the political power in the multinational institutions, certainly not at the IMF. In 2014, the UN launched the process to create a multinational mechanism for sovereign debt restructuring. In 2015, it passed 9 principles that should be the basis of that mechanism, and there's been virtually no progress since then. There were 6 countries that opposed it, but they are the creditor nations: the US, UK, Japan, Israel, Canada, and Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
So from my side, I can't see that any one of the existing institutional organization can lead such initiative. We do need coordination, but I told you about the MENA. We don't have one MENA. We have 2 MENAs at least. I can talk about the African Union, for example, or the African Development Bank. Where are they? So they are mostly caring about the IMF, caring about the World Bank more than citizens living in Africa. Islamic Development Bank for the MENA region is the same. So they should lead such initiative, but they are caring about something else, not their citizens in general.
Let's take a couple more questions, Luis, and let's gather two. Go ahead.
So,
Go ahead.
Luis Vieira with the Bretton Woods Project. I have a quick question about looking forward. You know, when I asked a question to the managing director about quota reform and the legitimacy or the implications to the legitimacy of the fund, and she said, yes, we agree. If we don't succeed with this round of quota reform, we'll send a very damaging signal in terms of its legitimacy worldwide. So, you know, this question goes to Senor Guzmán and Paulo. Looking forward, what do you think are the consequences of a potential failure, which looks likely, of quota reform? You know, we talk a lot about fragmentation of multilateral institutions, and the fund, bank, and others are, you know, the UN Secretary-General recently spoke about the dangers of fragmentation. What would that look like? Because it seems to me that, for example, with surcharges, Argentina was at one point quite vocal about surcharges, and then, you know, the relationship with the IMF becomes a bit more difficult, and things become a bit more quiet. So, you know, there's a, precisely because we have a crisis, and countries are so dependent on fund support, you know, what are the implications of that looking forward in terms of prospects for change related to Yolanda's question about Global South cooperation? Thank you.
Take another question in the back. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm Nadia Dora with Oxfam. Thank you, and sorry I came in late, so I missed, Laura, your presentation, but I'm going to read the paper, and I guess this question is for all of you, but it's thinking about practical steps. It's building on what Yolanda was asking, but thinking more specifically about the IMF, because we can talk about debt architecture, we can talk about financial architecture, and I know they're all interconnected, but I'm curious, given that we have the IMF quota reform underway to be finished by the end of next year, what are some practical things that we can be thinking about aiming towards in terms of shifting power within governance within the IMF? One of the things that we saw with the Argentina restructure of the last loan program was Argentina pushing back against the IMF. And that kind of power coming from a country that was negotiating with the IMF was super inspiring. But, you know, it had a strong hold on the IMF because the loan was so insanely large. At the same time, how do we build that power for other countries in negotiations? How do we shift power? Is it through not looking at, you know, quota reform? Is it through, I know our next session is on accountability. Is it through building citizen voice? All of these things connect, but just concrete things. They don't have to be practical and achievable in the next year, but what should we be striving towards? Because if we don't have an ideal, we don't know what steps to take to reach that ideal. It doesn't have to all be achieved in 1 year.
Let's take one more question, and then let's each of you take a few minutes to answer, and then I think we have just
That's me.
Yes, you. Go ahead.
Danny Bradlow, University of Pretoria. There's no question that we need more democracy, a more democratic governance structure in the IMF. But I think we have to be careful what we're wishing for with quota reform. Because almost any way you think about quota reform, sub-Saharan Africa is going to lose votes in the IMF. And that's going to mean less voice for African countries, partly because our economies are shrinking and our share of the global economy is going down. But if you look at it at an aggregate level, that's bad. And if you look below that at some of the countries, some countries will have almost no voice of any meaningful sort. And so I think we need to think very carefully about whether quota reform is actually the best thing to do. And one other thing on the UN, I think we should be really careful about thinking the UN is a solution to anything. Think what the UN did in Haiti. Through its negligence, it brought cholera to Haiti for the first time ever in its history. 10,000 people died as a result of that. People are still dying as a result of that, and the UN has refused to accept any responsibility for that. Why do we think an institution like that is the solution?
Well, it's a lot. Laura, let's start with you.
Yeah, one of the things I think on the accountability issue and so on, if we look back at all these IMF programs, and it's one of the things that I showed, they're mostly in countries that don't have any power. And we also know that most IMF programs fail. They have a very bad track record at achieving their growth projections. They always have this over-optimistic assumptions, And that's sort of like a structural thing, because when they do that, the creditors that are from the countries that have the power, they get a bailout, they get repaid, and then the people that get hurt by austerity policies and kind of get stuck in these programs of, conditions after conditions that tend to harm people in those countries have no sort of voice or accountability. Even, taking away the question of like, do their governments represent them, but neither the people nor the governments have any type of recourse. And that's kind of what, it's like, I don't know what realistically would change, and the US has to approve it, but at least pushing for a design and where like you have policies that are thought out in a way that they don't actively harm people, and there is some accountability for like the IMF when it fails as well. Maybe next session we'll discuss that. And on the quota thing and the reform and losing votes, it's like, why do votes have to be linked to quotas in that way? Right now, like votes are, you have 5.5% of votes that are divided equally, and the rest are based on quota. Like, what says it has to be 5.5? Why is that number not higher? Why is it, So that's kind of where we can also think of like quota reform. It's not just the actual quota distribution, but why do we link the, in a democracy, you don't have voting power based on how much money you have.
Okay. Paulo, why don't we go to you?
Well, thank you. Two issues I would like to address based on the questions I managed to hear here. First, the issue of global South coordination that was raised by one person. Unfortunately, I didn't catch the names, but it's an important issue. However, we have to look at this realistically, because my experience has been that international coordination is more easily said than done. It's very, very difficult. Even getting together, we should be practical. This means looking at regional coordination, for example. It means looking at plurilateral, trans-regional cooperation also, like the BRICS, but not only the BRICS, and not a fanciful global South plans which are not really
We keep losing you,
came from the floor, are the practical aspects of the upcoming quota reform. I can't say that I'm aware of all the details. It's very difficult to follow IMF issues from the outside, because like Martin Guzman mentioned, there's a lack of transparency. The IMF pays lip service to transparency, but does not really practice it. But based on my experience, I would say, first of all, practically speaking, you need to increase the size of IMF quotas, the overall size. If you don't do that, you cannot really redistribute, because there's a rule in the Articles of Agreements that makes individual reduction of quotas impossible. So to increase the relative size of the countries, of the developing countries, you need to increase the overall size of quotas. And you need to change the quota formula, which we struggled to do. We managed to improve the quota formula, but it is still very inadequate. My view, quota formula to reflect world realities should be based fundamentally on PPP, GDP, PPP, gross domestic products based on PPP, purchasing power parity criterion. And as Lara just said, and I think someone else, you need
We've just lost you, Paulo. Can you try to repeat it?
He might not be able to
Come back.
First, effects on poor should be the fundamental criterion combined with market GDP. But as Lara said, you need to take into account the effects on poorer and smaller countries. So combine a new formula with an increase in basic votes. That's theoretically possible as well. And last but not least, and that goes to what Bradlow was saying right now, Danny
Sorry, Paulo. I'm just gonna interrupt because we can't understand you very well. I'm gonna go now to Martin, please.
Thank you. So in the last point, of course,
We'll come back, Paulo. Sorry.
Of course, we have to be careful with the design of any mechanism. If we replicate something that is not working, it will certainly not work. But that doesn't mean that we should stop trying to build a mechanism that works, because what we have now, it's just producing very bad outcomes. On the nature of the negotiations with the IMF, Argentina's capacity is uncommon for most debtors all over the world. Right? Ultimately, it's very important to create or contribute decisively to the creation of a global common sense on what needs to be done. So that battle is very important. No one wants to have a bad image. So, for instance, the IMF may push for the standard austerity policies in the times of recession that we know they haven't worked, but they don't want the government to say that the IMF is pushing for that. And governments should be courageous. They represent the interests of the people. If that's happening, it's part of the transparency issue. So people have to know. In Argentina, we had something absolutely novel, which was it was the first time in history that a program with the IMF had to be approved by the National Congress. It's a bill that we proposed in 2020 and was passed by Congress in 2021. So in 2022, the program had to be approved by Congress, and that happened. And one last comment, and Paulo knows this very well, at the board of the IMF, the voices are represented are the voices of the financial sectors of the country mostly, because it's the finance ministry or the central bank that has the governor chair at the IMF. But in this process of resolving that crisis, there are distributional consequences. Maybe the American companies that produce goods want to export more to the country, and the country has lower import capacity if it's using its foreign exchange to repay debt. So if the voice of the financial interest is overrepresented at the IMF, and the voice of the real economy is underrepresented at the IMF, and that's part of the problem for the outcomes that we have been observing.
Kareem?
Just one word about, reforming or not the quota system and the governance. Yes, definitely yes. But the question will remain open, how are we going to reform the quota? Because in the global south we have also to care about something else, which is human rights in democracy. Reforming the quota can bring, maybe it's a hypothesis, can bring more authoritarian regime also in the region and less human rights. So it's not just about quota and bringing more money to our countries, but also contributing in building democratic and human rights countries in general. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, are you in a better place? Is your...
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Zoom is not working very well, but shall I just come back quickly to the practical aspects of the quota reform?
Yes.
As I was trying to say,
briefly,
there's a few issues here. Let me just explain to you my experience. Devil is in the details, God as well. So you cannot productively speak about quota reform without knowing the full-scale details. And at least a few points. You have to have an overall quota increase. That relates to the point that Lara was making, that the shift in board resources, in the resource fund to board resources as opposed to quotas, is an impediment to change in governance and distribution of voting power. The change in the quota formula, my opinion, GDP-PPP is a fundamental criterion. Yep. But also, as Lara also mentioned, basic votes should increase as a proportion of total votes. No need to keep it where it is, very small. And basic votes are important for smaller countries and for least developing economies as well. And finally, and this goes to the point made by Danny Bradlaugh, voice. The voice depends on the composition of the board. The board is skewed towards European participation. Europe has about eight chairs. Are commanded by Europeans. And Africa has 2 chairs. We should increase the number of African chairs and reduce the number of European chairs. And finally, you know, we have the IDB headquartered in Washington. It's the Inter-American Development Bank. We, Latin Americans, mistakenly allowed the rule that the command of the IDB, the president of the IDB, should always be a Latin American to lapse. And until recently, we had an American citizen there as well. Now, we should have an agreement that IDB, World Bank, and IMF command should not be selected by nationality. At least, this is what everything I said here about the practical aspects of quota and governance reform are, we know what we need to do fundamentally. But the political situation does not allow us to make progress. And this will lead to an increasing situation where the IMF, the World Bank, will have less importance for us, inevitably. They don't change. We regard them as less important.
Thank you so much. I think we have to
Thank
stop
you. I
now
have
so
back
we
the
can
floor.
move on. Thank you. I'm so sorry. I know there are more questions in the room, and there are so many more things for each of our experts to say. But I think we really got a good perspective of some of the problems, the challenges.
Thank you very much.